A quick heads up. This story explores themes that some listeners might find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. Imagine working in a place dedicated to healing, a place built on the principles of transparency and care, only to discover a part of it that, according to every official document, every blueprint, every single person you asked, was utterly impossible. A wing that simply wasn't there. Yet you saw it, you felt it, and the harder you tried to understand, the more it felt like the hospital itself was trying to erase your very memory. This is what happened to Emily Hayes. Emily was, by all accounts, a pragmatist, a registered nurse with a meticulous eye for detail, and a healthy skepticism for anything that couldn't be explained by science or logic. She'd spent the last 5 years navigating the chaotic, demanding world of emergency rooms, first in a bustling city hospital, then in a smaller, community-focused facility. She was good at her job, exceptional even, known for her calm under pressure, and her uncanny ability to spot a subtle change in a patient's condition that others might miss. When she accepted the position at Evergreen General Hospital, a sprawling, historic institution in a quiet suburban town, she was looking for a fresh start, a less frantic pace, a chance to settle down. She certainly wasn't looking for a ghost story. Evergreen General was old, built in the 1920s, with multiple additions tacked on over the decades, creating a fascinating, sometimes confusing architectural maze. Its Gothic Revival facade, with its towering archways and intricate stone carvings, gave way to a labyrinth of modern, glass-fronted extensions and renovated wings. Navigating it was an art form, a skill new hires had to master quickly. Emily, with her innate sense of direction and photographic memory for layouts, took to it faster than most. After her first month, she could practically walk the sprawling complex blindfolded, every ward, every lab, every administrative office etched into her mind. Or so she thought. It was a Tuesday evening, late autumn, and the kind of chill that promised an early winter had settled over the town. Emily was on the night shift, a quiet one so far, and had just finished her rounds in the pediatric ward on the 3rd floor. A new admission had come in, a little boy named Timmy with a nasty fever, and Emily needed to retrieve his updated chart from the records department. The department, she knew, was tucked away on the far side of the building, requiring a trek through a less frequented corridor on the 2nd floor. Usually, she'd take the main elevator, but a maintenance crew was working on it, so she opted for a service elevator she knew was rarely used. She stepped out onto the 2nd floor. The air immediately cooler, smelling faintly of disinfectant and old dust. The corridor was dimly lit, rows of flickering fluorescent lights casting long dancing shadows. To her left, the familiar heavy fire door marked records and archives. To her right, a long empty stretch that led to the hospital's older, rarely used storage facilities. But directly across from the service elevator, where there should have been a blank wall, or perhaps another utility closet, there was a door. It wasn't just any door. It was a solid oak door, darker than the standard hospital doors, with an ornate brass handle that looked out of place, almost antique. Above it, a small polished brass plaque, the kind you might find on a doctor's private practice, simply read, Wing 7. Emily frowned. Wing 7? That didn't make any sense. Evergreen General had 6 wings, clearly labeled and easily identified on every map she'd studied. There was Wing A, the main administrative wing, Wing B, surgical, Wing C, maternity, Wing D, general medicine, Wing E, critical care, and Wing F, pediatrics. There was no Wing 7. Not on any blueprint she'd ever seen, not in any orientation manual she'd read, not in any conversation she'd had with colleagues. She paused, her hand hovering over the records door, a strange prickle of unease crawling up her spine. Had she just forgotten something fundamental about the hospital layout? Impossible. She was too good for that. This wasn't a closet or a boiler room. The door looked substantial, important, like it led to an active, functioning part of the hospital. And the hallway beyond the door, visible through the narrow gap where it hadn't quite latched shut, was dimly lit, stretching off into what looked like a long, wide corridor. Curiosity, a powerful force in any mystery, tugged at her. She took a step towards it, her hand reaching for the brass handle. But then a voice, sharp and unexpected, cut through the silence. Nurse Hayes? Everything all right? Emily jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around to see Dr. Miller, a seasoned orthopedic surgeon known for his dry wit and even drier demeanor, emerging from the records department. He was clutching a stack of patient files, his brow furrowed. "Oh, Dr. Miller," Emily said, trying to sound nonchalant, pulling her hand back from the mysterious door. "Yes, just admiring the architecture. This hospital has some interesting nooks and crannies." Dr. Miller grunted, glancing briefly at the wall where Emily had been looking. His eyes seemed to pass right over the oak door, as if it weren't even there. "Indeed. Old buildings always do. You looking for Timmy's chart?" "Yes, I was just heading in." Emily forced a smile, her mind still reeling. Had he not seen it? Or was he just ignoring it? The entire interaction felt off. She walked past him into the records department, stealing one last look over her shoulder. The oak door was still there, still slightly ajar, still proclaiming Wing 7. Retrieving Timmy's chart, Emily found herself distracted. Her usual efficiency was replaced by a nagging sense of disbelief. How could she have missed an entire wing? And how could Dr. Miller, who had practically grown up in this hospital, not even acknowledge its existence? Back on the third floor after attending to Timmy, Emily couldn't shake the feeling. She pulled out her phone and accessed the hospital's internal network, navigating to the facilities management section. She found the digital blueprints, meticulously detailed, color-coded, and regularly updated. She zoomed in on the second floor. She examined every square inch of the area around the service elevator. Nothing. There was the records department. There was the storage corridor. And there was a solid, unbroken wall where Wing 7 should have been. It was as if the digital blueprint had been deliberately scrubbed clean, or perhaps the wing had never existed at all. But she had seen it. She had practically touched it. The next morning after her shift, Emily was still perplexed. She decided to approach someone she trusted, someone less likely to dismiss her. Sarah Rodriguez, a fellow RN Emily had befriended, was known for her open-mindedness and her encyclopedic knowledge of hospital gossip. "Hey, Sarah," Emily began casually, sipping her lukewarm coffee in the staff lounge. "Quick question. You've been here, what, 7 years now?" Sarah nodded, scrolling through her phone. "8 come December." "Why?" "Just curious," Emily said, trying to keep her voice light. "You ever hear anything about a Wing 7 here at Evergreen? Or maybe a section that used to be called Wing 7? Sarah lowered her phone, a puzzled expression on her face. "Wing 7? No, never. We've got a through F, that's it." "Why? Did a new patient try to tell you they were from some secret wing?" She chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. No. I thought I saw a door on the second floor, near the old service elevator that said Wing 7. It looked like a whole separate section." Emily tried to sound as if she were simply clarifying a minor detail. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowed in thought. "Near the service elevator? That's just the records department and then storage. There's nothing else there. No door, certainly not a whole wing. Are you sure you weren't just tired? Night shifts can play tricks on you." She gave Emily a sympathetic look. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Sarah wasn't being dismissive or rude. She genuinely seemed to have no idea what Emily was talking about. It was as if Emily had described a purple elephant doing ballet in the corridor. The sincerity in Sarah's confusion was more unsettling than outright denial. "No, I'm sure," Emily insisted, a tremor in her voice she couldn't quite hide. "It was a dark oak door, brass plaque. I mean, it was there." Sarah just shook her head slowly. "Emily, I've worked every floor of this hospital. There's no Wing 7. Never has been, as far as I know. Maybe it was an old sign from a previous renovation that someone forgot to take down, and it just looked like a door. But it hadn't just looked like a door. It was a door. It was slightly ajar. Emily had seen the hallway beyond it. The image was burned into her mind. The faint metallic smell that wasn't quite disinfectant. The unusual quiet that seemed to emanate from it. Over the next few days, the incident gnawed at her. She kept replaying it in her mind, scrutinizing every detail. Was she imagining things? Was she overtired, as Sarah suggested? Emily Hayes, the pragmatic, logical nurse, was beginning to doubt her own sanity. This was a hospital, not a haunted mansion. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that what she had seen was real. And the fact that no one else seemed to acknowledge it only deepened the mystery. She started looking for subtle clues. She observed her colleagues more closely, listening for any passing mentions, any accidental slips. She paid attention to the hospital's rhythm, the flow of staff, The deliveries? Nothing. Everyone went about their business as if the hospital ended squarely at Wing F. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to sprout into a full-blown obsession. Emily found herself drawn back to the second floor, to that specific spot, whenever she had a spare moment. Each time, her heart would pound with a mix of fear and desperate hope. She wanted to prove to herself, and to everyone else, that she wasn't crazy. One afternoon during her lunch break, she decided to be more deliberate. She took the main staff elevators, making a point to seem casual, holding a coffee cup and scrolling through her phone. She walked slowly down the second-floor corridor, past the records department, feigning interest in a poster about flu shots. Her eyes scanned the wall where the oak door should be, and there it was, exactly as she remembered. The dark oak, the ornate brass handle, the simple plaque. Wing 7. This time it was fully closed, the gap she'd seen before sealed tight. But it was undeniably there. It was solid. It was real. A wave of relief washed over her, quickly followed by a fresh surge of dread. It wasn't a hallucination. But if it was real, why did no one else know about it? Why was it erased from every official record? And what exactly was inside Wing 7, the wing that wasn't on the blueprint? She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and pressed her ear against the cold, smooth wood. She held her breath, listening. And from deep within she heard it. A faint rhythmic thumping, like a slow, steady heartbeat. Or something far, far worse. Sarah snatched her hand back from the door as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The thumping. It echoed in the sudden silence of the corridor. A phantom rhythm she couldn't shake. Was it real? Or had the oppressive quiet of the night shift, combined with the strange, forgotten door, finally started to play tricks on her mind? She pressed her palms against her eyes, taking a shuddering breath. No, it wasn't a trick. The sound had been too distinct, too unsettlingly present. A slow, steady thump-thump, thump-thump. Not the irregular clanking of old pipes, nor the hum of ventilation shafts. This was organic, deliberate, or at the very least alive. Her gaze darted around the empty hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the polished linoleum. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The door, however, remained an anomaly. A smooth, featureless slab of dark wood set into the wall where there should have been nothing but a continuous expanse of plaster. There was no handle, no keyhole, no seam where a frame might meet the wall. It was as if it had simply appeared, solid and impenetrable. A secret buried within the hospital's very structure. A cold bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. Sarah's rational mind, honed by years of emergency medicine, struggled to find an explanation. An old service elevator shaft? A disused boiler room? But those would have access panels, warning signs, or at the very least a handle. This was nothing. Just a door that wasn't supposed to be there, hiding a sound that defied logic. She forced herself to take another step closer, her eyes scanning the edges of the door. The wood was seamless, perfectly flush with the wall, almost as if it had been sealed from the outside. A shiver, colder than the hospital's air conditioning, ran down her spine. No, she couldn't just leave it. Not now that she'd heard that. Her mind raced back to the blueprints she'd found in the dusty old records office. She'd scanned them quickly, looking for her new assigned wing, but her memory insisted this area should have been a solid wall. A storage closet, perhaps, or just a structural support. But certainly not a door leading into a hidden wing. The thought gnawed at her. Had she missed something? Was this just a common architectural quirk of an aging building? Or was it something far more deliberate? She had to know. Trying to appear nonchalant, Sarah walked briskly back towards the main nurse's station on her floor. The digital clock above the desk glowed 3:17 a.m. The graveyard shift stretched long, and the hospital was in its deepest slumber. Emily, another nurse from the night shift, was engrossed in charting, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Hey, Emily," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light, betraying none of the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She grabbed a lukewarm coffee from the pot. Emily looked up, pushing her glasses higher on her nose. "Sarah, everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." She chuckled, but her eyes held a hint of concern. "Just a long night," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Listen, quick question. You've been here longer than me, right? Do you remember anything about an old sealed-off section on this floor? Down past the old linen closet, near the emergency stairwell. Emily paused, tapping her pen against her chin. Sealed off? Not that I recall. There's the boiler room in the basement and some old storage up on the 5th floor, but nothing like that on this level. Why? Did you find another one of Dr. Miller's shortcut doors? She rolled her eyes playfully, referring to a notoriously eccentric former surgeon known for creating unauthorized passages between departments. No, nothing like that, Sarah said, trying to sound casual, though her heart was still pounding. I was looking at some of the older blueprints today, trying to familiarize myself with the layout, and it looked like there was a section that just wasn't accounted for. Like a blank space. Emily shrugged. This place is ancient, Sarah. Built in the late 1800s, renovated a dozen times. I'm sure there are parts of it that even the architects have forgotten about. Probably just an old utility shaft or something that got walled off during a renovation decades ago. Don't worry about it. Unless it's leaking anything weird, it's probably harmless. She went back to her charting, clearly dismissing the topic. But Sarah couldn't dismiss it. A blank space. That's exactly what she remembered. Not a labeled room, not an office, not even a janitor's closet. Just a void where something should have been. And now at that void there was a door. A door with a heartbeat. You know where they keep the truly old blueprints? Sarah asked, her voice a little too eager. The ones from before the 1950s renovations? Emily gestured vaguely. Probably in the main archives, basement level, subsection Gamma. Good luck though. That place is a labyrinth. And don't get locked in with the ghosts of past administrators, they're the worst. She grinned, oblivious to the genuine unease stirring within Sarah. Ignoring Emily's joke, Sarah felt a new surge of determination. She had to see those original blueprints. If that section was truly missing from the official plans, it meant something. It meant the hospital was hiding something. She made her excuses, grabbed her flashlight, and headed for the basement. The journey felt like descending into the hospital's subconscious. The air grew cooler, heavier, smelling of dust and forgotten things. The main archives were indeed a maze of towering metal shelves, crammed with yellowed files and rolled-up documents. Subsection Gamma was even worse, a dimly lit corner where the oldest records resided, shrouded in cobwebs. After what felt like an hour of searching, Sarah finally found them. A series of massive canvas-back scrolls tied with brittle twine. St. Jude's Hospital Original Construction Plans, 1898. One label read, barely legible. Her hands trembled as she carefully unrolled the largest one on a nearby dilapidated table. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight. The blueprint was a masterpiece of intricate lines and faded ink, detailing every wall, every room, every pipe of the original structure. Sarah's finger traced the familiar outline of her current floor, moving past the nurse's station, past the patient rooms, past the emergency stairwell. And then her breath hitched. There it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. Where the smooth, featureless wooden door now stood, the original blueprint showed a solid, uninterrupted wall. It wasn't a utility shaft, not a storage closet, not even a proposed expansion that had been abandoned. It was just wall. A blank, undifferentiated section of the building's exterior. No indication of any access point. No hint of an internal space beyond it. But then, as her eyes scanned further, she noticed something even more disturbing. Faintly visible beneath a later, almost invisible patch of draftsman's ink, there were ghost lines. Fainter than the original drawing, almost erased, but undeniably there. They outlined a large rectangular space behind that solid wall. A space roughly the size of a small wing, complete with what looked like individual rooms and a central corridor. It wasn't just a void. It was a redacted void. Someone at some point had deliberately drawn a solid wall over an existing structural plan, effectively erasing an entire section of the hospital from its own history. And now a door had appeared there. A door leading into that erased space. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool basement air. This wasn't a forgotten room or a quirky renovation. This was a secret, a deliberate omission. And the rhythmic thumping she'd heard from behind that door suddenly took on a far more sinister meaning. She rolled up the blueprint, her mind buzzing with a terrifying clarity. Emily was wrong. This wasn't harmless. This was deeply, profoundly wrong. Driven by an urgent, almost desperate need for answers, Sarah practically ran back upstairs. The hospital felt different now, imbued with a new, unsettling quality. Every shadow seemed deeper, every distant cough more ominous. When she reached the corridor, Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, falling directly on the dark wooden door. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm that mimicked the one she'd heard. She pressed her ear against the cold wood again, holding her breath. Silence. Her shoulders slumped in a mix of relief and disappointment. Maybe it had been her imagination after all. Maybe the old building just settled, or the pipes. Then it started again. Not a faint thumping this time. It was louder, more insistent. A slow, heavy asterisk thump, thump, thump star. And beneath it, almost imperceptible at first, a faint, rasping sound, like something dragging, or someone trying to catch their breath. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't a heartbeat. This was a struggle. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that whatever was behind that door, it was not meant to be forgotten. It was still there, and it was very much alive. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't a heartbeat. This was a struggle. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that whatever was behind that door, it was not meant to be forgotten. It was still there, and it was very much alive. The chilling rhythmic thudding ceased as abruptly as it had begun, plunging the forgotten corridor back into an even more profound, oppressive silence. Sarah stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the cold, unyielding metal, the phantom vibration seeming to echo in her very bones. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, a small ragged sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to sprint back to the brightly lit, bustling floors of the hospital, to pretend she'd never found this place, never heard that sound. But another deeper part of her, the part that had chosen nursing as a calling, the part that couldn't ignore suffering, held her rooted to the spot. What had she heard? A struggle, a desperate primal thrashing. Not a mechanical hum, not the groan of old pipes, but something organic, something living fighting against an unseen restraint. Her mind, trained to diagnose and categorize, scrambled for a rational explanation. An animal? A large rat perhaps? A stray cat? But the sheer force, the deliberate rhythm, the impact she felt through the thick steel, dispelled those flimsy excuses almost instantly. This was no rodent. This was something substantial, something human-sized. A wave of nausea washed over her, cold sweat prickling at her hairline. She peeled her hand from the door, wiping it on her scrubs as if trying to erase the sensation. The door itself was a mute, dark sentinel, offering no further clues. No keyhole, no handle, just a seamless expanse of dull metal, marred only by faint scratches that looked ancient, like forgotten hieroglyphs. She took a step back, then another, her gaze sweeping the desolate corridor. The peeling paint, the flickering emergency light, the oppressive quiet. It all coalesced into a suffocating blanket of dread. She had to get out. She had to process this. Turning on her heel, Sarah retraced her steps, her pace quickening with each stride. The phantom echo of the thudding seemed to chase her, urging her onward. She navigated the labyrinthine turns, her mind racing, a frantic carousel of fear and disbelief. Had she imagined it? Was the stress of her demanding residency finally getting to her? No. The feeling in her hand, the visceral shock, was too real, too immediate. She knew what she had heard. Finally, she burst through the double doors leading back to the active neurosurgery wing. The sudden rush of fluorescent light and the murmur of voices almost blinding and deafening. She leaned against the wall, taking deep, shaky breaths, trying to compose herself. A young resident, Dr. Kevin Miller, passed by, offering a quick, distracted nod. "Rough night, Jenkins?" he asked, not breaking stride. Sarah managed a weak smile. "You could say that." She spent the remainder of her shift in a daze, her movements automatic, her mind replaying the terrifying encounter. Every creak of the old hospital, every distant clang, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. How could such a place exist, hidden in plain sight, and not be on any records? More importantly, who or what was behind that door? And why was it being kept secret? The questions gnawed at her, refusing to be silenced. By the time her shift ended, a new resolve had solidified within her. She couldn't just walk away. The sound of that struggle, the undeniable presence of something alive and suffering, demanded answers. Her first stop was the hospital's administrative archives. It was a dusty, cavernous room in the basement, rarely visited by anyone outside the records department. Emily Carter, the head archivist, a woman with a penchant for cardigans and a perpetually unimpressed expression, greeted Sarah with a weary sigh. Nurse Jenkins, what brings you down to the catacombs today? Lost a chart? Emily asked, adjusting her glasses. No, Emily. I'm actually looking for something a bit older, Sarah began, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm doing some research for a personal project on the hospital's historical architecture. I was hoping to look at some of the original blueprints, maybe some construction manifests from the mid-20th century. Emily raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Historical architecture, you say? Well, aren't you ambitious? Everything's digital these days, you know. But if you insist on the paper trail, follow me. Emily led her to a section of towering metal shelves crammed with massive, rolled-up scrolls tied with faded ribbons. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Original construction was 1948, Emily rattled off, pulling down a couple of heavy rolls. Then major renovations in 63, 78, and the big expansion in 95. We've got all the plans here. Just be careful, some of these are delicate. Sarah thanked her, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. She found a large, vacant table and carefully unrolled the first blueprint. It was a sprawling diagram of the hospital's ground floor, meticulously detailed with rooms, corridors, and utility shafts. She scanned it, her finger tracing the familiar layout of the neurosurgery wing. She found the janitorial closet, the old linen storage, even the rarely used staff lounge. But as she moved her finger towards the area where she'd found the hidden corridor, there was nothing, just a solid, unmarked wall. She unrolled the next blueprint, dated 1963. Again the same blank space. The 1978 plans. The 1995 expansion. Each one showed the same familiar layout, the same absence. It was as if that entire section of the hospital, the corridor, the door, and whatever lay behind it, simply didn't exist on paper. It was a ghost wing, a phantom limb of the building that had been deliberately excised from its official history. A cold dread began to seep into her bones, far deeper than the initial fear. This wasn't just an oversight. This was a deliberate act of concealment. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase this section from all records. But why? And for how long? Find what you're looking for, Nurse Jenkins? Emily's voice startled her, pulling her from her intense concentration. Emily was standing a few feet away, holding a stack of old patient files. Not exactly, Sarah stammered, quickly rolling up the blueprint. It's more complex than I thought. Do you have any general hospital logs? Like maintenance requests, or even old staff directories from the early days? Emily sighed again, a sound that conveyed the immense effort required to even consider the request. Logs? We have everything, dear. But it's all organized by department and year. You'd have to be more specific. What exactly are you hoping to find? Anything unusual, Sarah said, perhaps a little too quickly. Any mention of restricted areas, or sections of the hospital that were decommissioned without explanation. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of suspicion entering her gaze. Restricted areas are usually clearly marked, nurse, and decommissioned wings are either renovated or demolished. There's always paperwork. This isn't some horror movie, you know? Sarah forced a laugh, trying to mask her growing unease. Of course not. Just trying to be thorough for my project. Emily shrugged, then pointed to a row of imposing metal filing cabinets. The general logs are over there by decade. Good luck. Some of those old ledgers are practically falling apart. Sarah nodded her thanks and moved towards the cabinets, feeling Emily's gaze on her back for a moment longer than comfortable. She pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger from the 1950s. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the meticulous handwriting of a long-gone administrator was still legible. She began to pore over the entries, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Maintenance requests for odd parts of the building, unexplained budget allocations, unusual personnel transfers. Hours passed in a blur of yellowing paper and cryptic entries. Her eyes began to ache, her head throbbed, but she couldn't stop. The silence of the archive was punctuated only by the rustle of pages and the occasional distant hum of the building's ancient ventilation system. She found nothing directly about a hidden wing, no mention of the specific corridor or a mysterious door. It was as if the official history of the hospital had been carefully curated, every anomaly smoothed over. Just as despair began to settle in, as she was about to give up on the 1950s ledger and move to the next decade, her finger brushed against something unusual. Tucked deep within the binding, almost invisible, was a single folded piece of paper, smaller than the ledger pages, and distinctly different in texture. It felt thicker, almost like parchment. With trembling fingers, Sarah carefully extracted it. It was old, very old and brittle, threatening to tear at her touch. Unfolding it revealed not text, but a crude hand-drawn sketch. It wasn't a blueprint, it was more like a diagram hastily scrawled. And on it, amongst a jumble of lines and symbols that vaguely resembled parts of the hospital, was a distinct, heavily shaded rectangle. Emerging from this rectangle were two bold, jagged lines, almost like claw marks, and beneath them, a single stark word, written in a hand that seemed to tremble even on the page. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The paper was cold against her palm, yet a sudden burning heat spread through her chest. This wasn't an official document. This was a warning, a desperate, terrified message from someone long ago. The rectangle, she realized with a sickening lurch, was positioned exactly where the hidden door and the unlisted wing should be. And the word it echoed the primal struggle she had heard, the unidentifiable presence. She looked up, her gaze darting around the dusty archive, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. The silence now felt less peaceful and more watchful. She quickly refolded the paper, tucking it deep into her pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew with chilling certainty that she had just found the first real clue, and it was far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The crumpled note felt like a burning coal in her pocket. The children suffer. The experiments continue. They never left. Each word echoed in her mind, a gruesome, impossible whisper. She leaned against the cold concrete wall, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't just about an unmapped wing anymore. This was about something profoundly sinister, buried deep within the hospital's history, perhaps still alive. Her first instinct was to run, to leave this place and never look back. But then the faces flashed in her mind. The terrified patients, the confused staff, the chilling silence of the hidden corridor. She couldn't just walk away. Not now. She had to know. She needed to know. Who could she tell? Who would believe her? Dr. Evans would likely dismiss it as stress or an overactive imagination, especially after her previous concerns. No, it had to be someone who had seen some of the strangeness, someone who, despite his skepticism, had a logical mind. David. She found David in the break room, hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, a tired smile gracing his lips. "Hey Emily, everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled out the note, her hand trembling slightly as she unfolded it. "I found this in the old records room behind a loose panel." David took the paper, his brow furrowing as he read the hastily scrawled words. His smile vanished. He read it again slowly, then looked up at her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Concern, confusion, maybe even a hint of fear in his eyes. What is this, Emily? A prank." "It's not a prank, David. It was hidden, deeply hidden, and it feels real, like a cry for help from decades ago." She recounted her discovery of the loose panel, the dust, the way the note had been tucked away. She told him about the chilling atmosphere in the unmapped wing, the cold spots, the faint sound she'd heard. David ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure beginning to fray. "Children? Experiments? Emily, this sounds like something out of a horror movie. Are you sure you're not just connecting dots that aren't there? This hospital used to be an asylum, sure, but that was a long time ago. They didn't do experiments on kids here." "How do you know what they did, David? We only know what the official records tell us. And what if the official records are incomplete? What if they're deliberately incomplete?" She leaned closer, her voice urgent. "Think about it. The wing that isn't on the blueprints. The way it feels. The way people avoid it. The things I've heard. And now this. It's all connected." He stared at the note again, his thumb rubbing the faded ink. Okay. Let's say for a second that this isn't a prank. What does "they never left" even mean? The children are still there? As ghosts? He scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "I don't know, David. But if this wing was for children and experiments were happening, it explains why it was erased. Why no one talks about it. It explains why it feels so wrong." Emily's voice was firm, resolute. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. We have to find out what happened. David sighed, a heavy, resigned sound. He knew Emily wasn't one to give up easily, especially when she felt something was wrong. And, to be honest, a part of him, a small logical part, was starting to feel a chill of its own. He had dismissed her before, but the note, combined with her unwavering conviction, was harder to ignore. "All right," he said, pushing himself up from the table. "All right. If we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. We can't go barging into some forbidden wing based on a cryptic note. We need facts. We need history. We need to find out what this hospital was really like in its early days, especially when it was an asylum." Their plan was simple yet daunting. The hospital had a small, rarely visited historical archive, tucked away in the basement, primarily for medical students doing research on past epidemics or treatment methods. It was usually locked, requiring special permission, but David, with his long tenure and a knack for navigating bureaucracy, had the key. They made their way down to the archives after their shift, the silence of the empty corridors amplifying the soft click of their shoes. The air in the basement was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a musty perfume that spoke of forgotten stories. David fumbled with a large, ornate brass key, finally coaxing the heavy oak door open with a groan. Inside, towering shelves crammed with leather-bound ledgers, yellowed patient files, and brittle newspapers stretched into the gloom. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long dancing shadows. "Welcome to the past," David muttered, switching on the light. "Try not to inhale too much history." They started with the oldest records they could find, looking for anything related to the hospital's transformation from an asylum to a general hospital. They pored over annual reports from the early 20th century, patient admission logs, and even old staff rosters. Emily was specifically looking for any mention of a children's ward or pediatric unit that didn't align with the current hospital structure, or any unusual treatment protocols. Hours blurred into a haze of flipping pages and scanning faded ink. Most of it was mundane, detailing budget allocations, staff changes, and the prevailing medical theories of the time. But every now and then, a phrase or a name would snag Emily's attention, sending a shiver down her spine. Mentions of remedial therapy for developmental challenges, or experimental treatments for behavioral disorders in children's cases, often followed by vague outcomes or transfers to specialized facilities, seemed to appear more frequently than she would have expected for a general asylum. David, meanwhile, focused on structural records. He was looking for old blueprints, architectural plans, anything that predated the current official schematics. He found several rolls of brittle sepia-toned paper, carefully unrolling them on a large, dusty table. Most showed the familiar layout, albeit with older names for wings and departments. But one, dated 1937, was different. "Emily, look at this," David called, his voice tight with excitement. He pointed to a section of the blueprint that, on current maps, was simply a solid block labeled storage or utility corridor. On this old plan, however, it was clearly demarcated as a series of small rooms branching off a central hallway. The handwriting was faded but discernible. "Children's ward, isolation and observation." Emily rushed over, her breath catching in her throat. "Children's ward, isolation and observation. That's it, David. That has to be it." The section on the blueprint perfectly matched the general location of the unmapped wing she had found. It was narrower, more confined than the rest of the hospital, almost like an afterthought or a deliberately secluded area. They continued to search, now with renewed purpose. They found a series of reports from the late 1940s, detailing a consolidation of services and modernization initiatives. A brief, almost throwaway line mentioned the decommissioning of the old children's ward due to structural concerns and relocation of patients. No mention of where the patients were relocated to, or why it wasn't rebuilt elsewhere. Just decommissioned, erased. As they delved deeper into the dusty records, a sense of unease settled over them. They found a series of patient files from that children's ward era. The names were common American names like Michael, Jessica, Daniel, Sarah. Their ages ranged from 6 to 12. The diagnoses were vague, often nervous disposition, unmanageable, or failure to thrive. But the treatments listed were disturbing: hydrotherapy, restraint therapy, sensory deprivation. And then a more chilling entry: experimental behavioral modification. Experimental behavioral modification? Emily whispered, her finger tracing the words on the brittle page. What does that even mean for a 6-year-old? David shook his head, his face grim. In the 30s and 40s, Emily, they tried all sorts of things. But this is dark. And the records after their decommissioning just stop. No transfer papers, no discharge summaries for these children. They just vanish from the hospital's records. The note in Emily's pocket felt heavier than ever. The children suffer. The experiments continue. They never left. The words resonated with a dreadful new meaning. A sudden sharp creak from the corner of the archive made them both jump. They spun around but saw nothing. Just the towering shelves and the dancing shadows. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. David nodded, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Just the building settling, probably. Or a rat. But his posture was tense, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass key. They decided to call it a night, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them. They carefully refolded the 1937 blueprint and tucked it into a protective sleeve, along with copies of the disturbing patient files. As they locked the archive door, Emily glanced back into the gloom. She could almost feel the presence of those forgotten children, their silent pleas echoing through the decades. The archive, once a dusty repository of facts, now felt like a tomb of secrets. They walked in silence through the deserted corridors, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The hospital felt different now, imbued with a sinister history they had just begun to uncover. The unmapped wing was no longer just a structural anomaly. It was a potential grave, a silent testament to unimaginable horrors. "So," David finally said, his voice low, "what now? We have a blueprint, we have disturbing records. We have a name for that wing." "Now," Emily replied, her gaze fixed ahead, her jaw set, "we go back. But this time we know what we're looking for. And we know what we might find." They were standing at the entrance to the forbidden corridor again, the familiar chill emanating from its dark mouth. But this time it wasn't just a physical cold. It was the icy grip of historical dread. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of a child's sob seemed to drift from within, or perhaps it was just the wind, or their own overwrought imaginations. Emily pulled out her phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing nothing but the peeling paint and the shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being waited for, was overwhelming. She took a deep breath, David beside her, and stepped into the unknown. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, as if the very walls were holding their breath. They moved slowly, cautiously, their eyes straining, their ears alert for any sound. And then, faintly, undeniably, from somewhere deeper within the hidden wing, they heard it again. A soft, almost musical whimper, followed by the distinct sound of something small being dragged across a stone floor. A shiver, colder than the stale air, ran through David, Jessica, and Michael. The sound again, that soft, almost musical whimper, followed by the distinct, unsettling scrape of something small being dragged across a stone floor. It was closer now, vibrating through the very soles of their shoes, a phantom echo of suffering in the suffocating silence. Their flashlights, once piercing beams of confidence, now seemed to merely push back the darkness ineffectually, creating more shadows than they dispelled. "Did you hear that?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely a breath. It was a rhetorical question, but the need to voice it, to acknowledge the impossible, was overwhelming. David nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes. And it sounds like it's moving away from us now, deeper in." He gestured with his flashlight, its beam trembling slightly, towards a narrow, dimly lit corridor that branched off to their right, disappearing into an even profounder darkness. Michael, usually the most outwardly stoic, gripped the strap of his backpack tighter. "We came all this way. We have to follow it." His voice was low, laced with a mix of fear and an unyielding resolve. The allure of the unknown, the sheer audacity of this hidden wing, was a powerful magnet. With renewed caution they moved. Each step was deliberate, their eyes scanning the oppressive gloom, their ears straining for the slightest repetition of the sound. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else, a faint metallic tang that hinted at old blood or rusted machinery. They passed what appeared to be an abandoned nurse's station, its counter littered with rusted instruments and overturned charts, their contents long since faded into illegibility. Beyond that, a series of patient rooms, their doors ajar like gaping mouths, revealed empty, stripped beds and peeling wallpaper. It was a ghost town within a ghost hospital, a place forgotten even by the passage of time. The corridor twisted and turned, each bend revealing more of the forgotten institution. They navigated around fallen ceiling tiles, past archaic medical equipment that lay overturned like skeletal remains, and through drifts of dust that had accumulated for decades. The whimper and the dragging sound did not repeat, but its impression lingered, a chilling promise of what lay ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of creeping dread, they reached a section of the wing that felt different. The walls here were thicker, made of a darker, rougher stone. The doors were heavier, reinforced with thick iron bands, and many featured small, grimy peepholes, suggesting observation or containment. This was not a regular patient ward. This was something else entirely. David pointed his light at one particular door, set slightly apart from the others. It was heavier, more intimidating than the rest, its surface scarred with what looked like deep gouges, as if something had tried to claw its way out. There was no number, no nameplate, just the raw, unyielding material of the door. But beneath it, barely visible in the dust, were faint, shallow drag marks. They led from the threshold across the cold, stone floor, and then seemed to disappear around the corner of the corridor they had just come from. "This is it," Jessica breathed, her voice hushed with a new kind of awe and terror. "This is where the sound came from." David tried the heavy iron handle. It was stiff, rusted, but with a grunt he managed to turn it. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the silent wing, revealing an interior as dark and foreboding as the corridor outside. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive blackness. The room was small, perhaps 10 by 10 feet, and stark. The walls were bare, a dull, institutional gray, but here and there, faded, childish drawings in crayon were barely visible beneath layers of grime. Stick figures, a crude sun, a flower. It was a jarring contrast to the heavy door and reinforced walls. In one corner, a small cot-like frame, stripped of any bedding, stood against the wall. A single, small, and very worn teddy bear lay face down on the dusty floor beside it, its once soft fur matted and discolored. The air in this room was even colder, carrying a faint, sweet, almost cloying scent that they couldn't quite identify. But what truly captured their attention were the marks on the floor. Clearer here, etched into the stone, were undeniable drag marks. They started from the cot, snaked across the floor, and converged towards the heavy door, disappearing under its threshold. It was as if something small yet resilient had been repeatedly moved out of this room. Jessica knelt, her flashlight beam fixed on the marks. Her gaze then drifted to a small, glinting object half buried in the dust, near where the drag marks began at the cot. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and picked it up. It was a locket, tarnished silver, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. It was old, intricately engraved with a faded floral pattern. With a careful thumb, she pressed the clasp. It sprung open with a soft click, revealing two tiny, oval photographs, both faded almost beyond recognition. One was of a young woman with kind eyes, her hair pulled back simply. The other, even more indistinct, was of a small child, a blurry smile on its face. The locket was warm in her hand, a poignant link to a past that felt unbearably close. Someone was kept here," Jessica whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A child." David's eyes darted around the room, taking in the small size, the reinforced door, the faint drawings. "This wasn't a regular patient room, Jessica. This was a holding cell. For a child." He ran his hand along the wall near where the drag marks converged, his fingers brushing against a slight irregularity. He pushed, and a section of the stone wall, seamlessly integrated, slid inward with a soft scrape. Behind it, a narrow, dark recess was revealed. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and dust, was a single leather-bound journal. It looked old, its cover worn, its pages yellowed and slightly water-damaged. Michael reached in carefully and retrieved it. He blew gently on the cover, dislodging a cloud of dust. The name on the front, embossed in faded gold, read, "Dr. Elias Thorne." "Thorne," Michael murmured, his brow furrowing. "That name. I think I saw it in some of the hospital archives, in a list of senior medical staff from the early 1960s. He was a highly respected pediatrician." They huddled together, their 3 flashlights converging on the journal. Michael carefully opened it, the old paper crackling faintly. The handwriting inside was precise, almost elegant, but the ink was faded in places. He began to read aloud, his voice low, the words echoing eerily in the confined space. October 17, 1963. The Foundation has approved the preliminary phase of Project Chimera. Our objective remains clear: stabilization and integration of anomalous neurological pathways. Subject Delta has been transferred to Wing Gamma. Initial observations confirm unique capabilities, though still largely uncontrolled. Michael paused, glancing at David and Jessica, his eyes wide. Project Chimera? Anomalous neurological pathways? What does that even mean? Jessica shook her head, a cold dread settling in her stomach. It sounds experimental. And Subject Delta? That's not a patient name. Michael continued, flipping a few pages forward, searching for more context. December 5, 1963. Subject Delta's response to sonic stimuli is profound. A peculiar sensitivity, almost a resonance. We've observed instances of localized environmental distortion when exposed to specific frequencies. The Foundation is pushing for accelerated results. Ethical concerns are mounting within the team, but Dr. Albright insists on the necessity of these unconventional methods. David's breath hitched. Sonic stimuli, a peculiar sensitivity to sound, that whimper we heard, and the dragging. Could it be related to this subject? Michael's finger traced a line down the page. Listen to this from a few weeks later. January 22, 1964. Containment breach protocols initiated. Subject Delta demonstrated an unprecedented level of cognitive manipulation, influencing the auxiliary staff to unlock its chamber. It was recovered unharmed, but the incident highlights the fragility of our current containment measures. The subject exhibits a profound, almost musical vocalization when distressed. It seems to be a form of communication, though one we do not yet comprehend. A profound, almost musical vocalization when distressed. The words hung in the air, a chilling echo of the sound they had heard just moments ago. The locket in Jessica's hand suddenly felt heavier, colder. Was the child in the photo Subject Delta? Was the whimper a cry for help, a desperate attempt to communicate, just as Dr. Thorne had described? Michael flipped further, his voice growing more strained. March 10, 1964. Subject Delta's abilities are evolving at an alarming rate. It seems to be able to project its distress, creating a localized auditory phenomenon that triggers a powerful empathic response in those nearby. We believe this is a defense mechanism, perhaps even a lure. The Foundation is now considering a new phase, a more invasive approach to ensure compliance. I fear what this will mean for the subject. I fear what it will mean for all of us. He stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on the page, then slowly lifted his head. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were seeing something beyond the dusty room. A lure, he whispered, the single word heavy with implication. The whimper, the dragging sound, it wasn't just distress. It was meant to draw us in. Just as the chilling realization settled upon them, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure brushed against their skin. The sweet, cloying scent in the room intensified, and then from somewhere very close but utterly unseen, they heard it again. Not a whimper, not a drag, but a soft, deliberate tap. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic, insistent sound, coming from the wall directly behind them. The tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. It was a soft sound, almost delicate, yet it resonated through the oppressive silence of the room, vibrating through the very air. Emily and David stood frozen, their breath hitched in their throats, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. It wasn't just a random noise, it had a clear, deliberate rhythm, like a single knuckle rapping gently against a solid surface. David, usually the more pragmatic of the two, felt a shiver crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the cool air. What is that?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. He tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation. Pipes? Old buildings settling. But even as he spoke the words, they sounded hollow, unconvincing. The sound was too precise, too intentional. Emily didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the wall directly behind them, the source of the persistent sound. She felt a primal fear, a deep-seated dread that this place, this forgotten wing, was far more active than they had ever imagined. The tapping wasn't coming from above or below, but directly from within the wall itself. Slowly, as if moving through thick molasses, they turned, their bodies stiff with apprehension, to face the blank concrete expanse. The tapping seemed to intensify, a tiny, insistent pulse in the vast, silent room. Asterisk tap. 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 Asterisk. It was coming from about waist height, slightly to the left of where they stood. David took a tentative step forward, his hand outstretched, trembling slightly. He pressed his palm against the cool, painted concrete. The vibration was faint, but unmistakable, directly beneath his fingertips. He leaned in closer, his ear almost touching the wall. It's inside," he breathed, the words heavy with a new kind of dread. "It's like someone's knocking from the other side." Emily swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a draft or an animal or a trick of the old building. This was something else entirely. "But there's nothing behind this wall, is there?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "It's the exterior wall, right? Or another room?" David shook his head slowly, his eyes scanning the surface. "No, this is deep within the building. It shouldn't be an exterior wall. And we haven't seen any rooms on the blueprint that would be directly behind this one in this specific wing." He ran his fingers along the painted surface, feeling for any anomaly, any crack or seam. The paint was old, peeling in places but generally uniform. Then his fingers brushed against something subtle, almost imperceptible. A faint ridge, a hairline imperfection that ran vertically down the wall. He pressed harder, tracing it with his fingertip. It felt like a seam, skillfully plastered over and painted numerous times throughout the decades. He glanced at Emily, then back at the wall. "Get your phone," he urged, his voice hushed. "Shine the light at an angle." Emily fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking slightly. She switched on the flashlight, its beam piercing the gloom, and directed it at the spot David indicated. The angled light immediately caught the subtle irregularity. What had looked like a random crack now revealed itself as a deliberate line. It wasn't just a single line, it was part of a larger, faint outline. As they traced it with their eyes and the beam of light, a rectangular shape began to emerge from the seemingly solid wall. It was tall and narrow, roughly the size of a door. The tapping continued, now seeming to come from the very center of this newly revealed rectangle. Asterisk tap. 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 Asterisk. It was like a prisoner trying to communicate, a desperate signal from a hidden space. "Oh my God," Emily breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and sudden, overwhelming comprehension. "It's a door. A hidden door." David nodded slowly, his face pale in the phone's glow. "It has to be. Someone sealed this off. Deliberately." He pressed his ear against the center of the outline again. The tapping was unmistakable. He ran his hand around the edges, feeling for any give, any latch or handle. The surface was smooth, unbroken. The concealment was masterful. Why would they seal it? Emily asked, her voice trembling. "And what's on the other side? Who's tapping?" The questions tumbled out, each one deepening the chilling mystery. As if in answer, the tapping stopped. Abruptly, the sudden cessation of sound was almost more terrifying than the tapping itself. The silence that descended was heavy, suffocating, amplifying the frantic beat of their own hearts. It was as if whatever was on the other side had just realized they were listening. David slowly straightened up, his eyes darting around the room, then back to the hidden outline. "We have to know," he whispered, his voice resonating with a strange mix of fear and insatiable curiosity. "We've come too far to turn back now." Emily looked at him, her fear warring with the same desperate need for answers. Her gaze lingered on the perfectly concealed seam. She noticed a tiny, almost invisible indentation near what would be the top right corner of the hidden door frame. A slight discoloration, a faint shadow where a handle should be, but wasn't. It was designed to be overlooked, a subtle push-release mechanism. "There," she pointed, her finger shaking slightly. "Up here. I think it's a latch of some kind." David followed her gaze, his heart pounding. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the faint indentation. He pressed it gently. There was a faint, almost imperceptible click, a soft mechanical sound that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence. He pushed against the wall again, this time with more force, near the outline. A faint tremor ran through the concrete. He pushed harder, grunting with effort. A thin line of dust, fine and ancient, puffed out from the seam. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the perfectly concealed door began to give way. It didn't swing open, It seemed to slide inward, then pivot stiff with decades of disuse. The air that rushed out was cold, stale, and heavy, carrying the scent of dust, decay, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely antiseptic, but deeply unsettling, like the smell of a long-abandoned morgue. With a final protesting groan of ancient hinges and grinding dust, a narrow sliver of absolute darkness was revealed. Emily quickly aimed her phone's flashlight into the void. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing a narrow, unlit corridor, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through comfortably. The walls were rough, unpainted concrete, starkly different from the finished, painted walls of the room they were in. The floor was covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust and debris, centuries of forgotten particles. The passage seemed to stretch into the darkness, curving slightly to the left, disappearing from their view. The air was noticeably colder inside, despite the relative warmth of the room they had left behind. It was a cold that seeped into their bones, a cold that felt unnatural, carrying with it a sense of deep, forgotten history. "Oh my God," Emily whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "It's real. All of it." David, his face a mask of awe and apprehension, took a hesitant step forward, peering into the inky blackness. The passage was an absolute void, a gaping maw that seemed to swallow the light from Emily's phone, barely illuminating the rough walls immediately in front of them. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Keep the light steady." He squeezed through the narrow opening, Emily following directly behind him, her back pressed against his. The hidden door creaked shut slightly behind them, not fully closing, but enough to make the room they had just left seem even more distant, more like a memory. They were truly on their own now, swallowed by the hidden depths of the old hospital. Their flashlights, two small beacons in the overwhelming darkness, danced across the walls. The passage was claustrophobic, the air thick with the scent of age and the unsettling metallic tang. Every whisper they exchanged seemed to be devoured by the oppressive silence, their voices sounding strangely muted. They took slow, deliberate steps, their boots crunching softly on the thick layer of dust and grit. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every subtle shift in the air felt like a presence. A few feet in, as Emily's light swept across the left wall, it caught something. Her breath hitched. "David, look." His light joined hers, focusing on the object. It was an old gurney, rusted and forgotten, pushed against the rough concrete wall, its wheels half buried in the accumulated dust. The metal frame was corroded, the padding ripped and stained. On its surface, a single faded white sheet lay neatly folded, as if carefully placed there and then simply abandoned. Beside it, a small, overturned four-stand lay on its side, its chrome dulled and pitted. This wasn't just a utility passage. This was part of a forgotten medical space, a place where patients had been, where procedures had been performed. But why was it sealed off? And why was there a gurney, a sheet, and four stands so carefully left behind? As David shone his light further down the passage, past the gurney, his blood ran cold. In the thick, undisturbed dust that covered the floor, he saw them. Distinct, fresh-looking boot prints. They weren't old, faint impressions. They were clear, deep indentations, leading deeper into the passage, away from where they now stood. Someone or something had been here recently, and they had gone further in. Then, as they stood there, frozen, the silence of the passage was broken by a new sound. Not a tap, not a scrape, not a groan. A single rhythmic drip. 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 It was a steady, cold, liquid sound, echoing from the darkness ahead, deeper within the hidden corridor. It was too regular, too deliberate to be mere condensation. It was the sound of something wet, something heavy hitting the floor with chilling precision. The air grew even colder, and they could almost feel a presence, just out of sight, waiting in the inky blackness that stretched before them. They were no longer alone in this forgotten wing. The silence that followed the clatter was far more terrifying than the noise itself. Michael's breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in his throat, and Sarah let out a small choked whimper beside him. Every nerve ending in their bodies screamed, urging them to run, to flee from the unseen horror that had just announced its presence. But the darkness, thick and impenetrable, seemed to press in on them, a physical weight that anchored their feet to the grimy floor. The air, already frigid, plummeted further, so cold it burned their lungs with each shallow inhale, and a faint metallic tang like old blood and rust prickled at the back of their noses. Michael, his hand trembling, slowly raised his flashlight, the beam a nervous, dancing spear in the abyss. Sarah clutched his arm, her grip vice-like, her eyes wide and darting, desperately trying to pierce the gloom. The light finally settled on the source of the sound, a few feet ahead of them. Lying on the floor, scattered across the dust and grime, was a collection of instruments. Not just any instruments, but old rusted surgical tools. A scalpel with a dulled blade, a pair of forceps stained dark with time, and a bone saw that looked disturbingly archaic. They looked as if they had been meticulously arranged on a small tarnished metal tray, which now lay overturned beside them. It was as if they had been placed on a shelf, ready for use, and then without warning violently swept to the floor. A cold, unseen tendril seemed to brush against Michael's cheek, sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He instinctively recoiled, stumbling backwards, pulling Sarah with him. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the oppressive quiet. Sarah could only nod, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes, however, were fixed on something beyond the fallen tools. Her flashlight beam, though less steady than Michael's, followed an almost imperceptible shift in the darkness, a shadow that seemed to deepen, to coalesce, just at the edge of their vision. It wasn't moving away from them. It was moving deeper into the wing, a silent invitation or perhaps a summons. A faint, almost inaudible whisper drifted through the air, too indistinct to form words, but clear enough to convey a sense of urgency, of pleading. It seemed to emanate from the direction the shadow had taken. Michael and Sarah exchanged a look of profound terror, but also, surprisingly, a flicker of morbid curiosity. They were trapped between the primal urge to flee and the chilling compulsion to understand. Against their better judgment, driven by an inexplicable force, they slowly, cautiously, followed the whisper and the shifting darkness. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating glimpses of their surroundings. Peeling paint, cracked plaster, empty gurneys draped in what looked like shrouds of dust, and the occasional unsettling glint of medical equipment discarded in the corners. The air grew heavier, thick with a sense of sorrow and despair, as if the very walls absorbed the suffering that had once permeated this place. The whisper grew a little stronger, leading them down a narrow corridor that seemed to twist and turn, further distancing them from the main hospital structure they knew. They passed what appeared to be examination rooms, each door ajar, revealing sterile, empty spaces that felt anything but. Finally, the whisper, now a mournful sigh, seemed to settle on a heavy, wooden door at the very end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness within darkness. Michael hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold, brass knob. Sarah squeezed his arm again, her nails digging into his skin. What if it's not trying to help us?" she breathed, her voice raspy. "I don't know," Michael admitted, his voice equally strained. "But it feels like it wants us to see something." Pushing the door open slowly, a guttural creak echoing in the silence, they peered inside. This was no ordinary patient room. The space was larger, circular almost, with a high vaulted ceiling that seemed to swallow the light. In the center stood a raised metal table, stark and unsettling, with thick leather straps hanging from its sides. Overhead, a single rusted lamp dangled precariously, its bulb long shattered. The walls were lined with shelves, not for medical supplies, but for what looked like ancient, leather-bound books and a collection of glass jars, some empty, others containing murky, unidentifiable specimens that had long since decayed into sludge. This wasn't a treatment room. This felt like a laboratory, or worse, a surgical theater for unspeakable acts. The metallic scent was stronger here, mingling with something else, something cloying and sweet, like formaldehyde and decay. Their flashlights swept across the room, finally landing on a small, heavy desk tucked into a corner. On it lay an open ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, but still legible. The binding was thick, embossed with an almost faded, unsettling symbol, a coiled serpent entwined around a skeletal hand. As they cautiously approached, the air around them became intensely cold, so cold that their breath fogged in front of their faces. The mournful whisper seemed to swirl around them, a chorus of unseen voices, growing louder, more desperate, as if urging them to read. Michael, his fingers trembling, carefully placed his flashlight on the desk, illuminating the ledger. The words, written in faded black ink, were meticulous, precise, and utterly chilling. The title at the top of the page read, "The Phoenix Protocol Patient Log, Dr. Alistair Finch." Below the title, entries were listed by date, patient name, and a brief description of their condition and treatment. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes scanning the horrific details. October 17, 1958, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Patient: Emily Davies, age 7. Diagnosis: acute respiratory distress. Protocol: stage 1 induced coma. Notes: subject exhibits unusual neural resilience. Increased dosage required. Michael's blood ran cold. Emily Davies, a child. He remembered the story from the local urban legends, the one about the little girl who vanished from the hospital in the late 50s. Sarah continued, her voice growing more strained with each word. November 3, 1958. Patient: Emily Davies. Protocol: stage 2 neural reintegration. Objective: enhanced cognitive function. Complications: severe convulsions, cardiac arrest. Resuscitation successful after 14 minutes. Subject remains unresponsive, but brain activity persists. The whispers around them intensified, a cacophony of sorrow and anguish. The temperature plummeted further, making their teeth chatter uncontrollably. They could almost hear the faint, distant screams that must have once echoed in this very room. December 1, 1958. Patient: Emily Davies. Protocol: stage 3 sensory deprivation and repatterning. Objective: behavioral modification. Complications: subject exhibits extreme distress, vocalizations constant. Sedation administered. Notes: subject's will to survive is remarkable. Further study required. Michael's eyes darted to the next entry, his heart hammering against his ribs. December 24, 1958. Patient: Emily Davies. Protocol: stage 4 final integration. Objective: complete control. Complications: subject expired during procedure. Cause of death: unforeseen systemic failure. Notes: despite failure, data collected is invaluable. Disposal of subject via standard protocol. Disposal? Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The word hung in the air, a grotesque echo of the unspeakable. As they stared at the chilling entry, a sudden sharp crack echoed from behind them. The heavy wooden door, which they had left ajar, slammed shut with a resounding thud that vibrated through the very floorboards. The sound was deafening in the sudden, profound silence that followed. The heavy brass lock clicked into place with a chilling finality. They spun around, their flashlights frantically sweeping the room, but there was nothing visible, only the oppressive darkness, made even more terrifying by the knowledge that they were now trapped. The air around them began to swirl, and a faint, shimmering outline, like heat haze but impossibly cold, began to coalesce near the center of the room, directly over the metal table. It wasn't a full apparition, but a distinct human-shaped distortion in the air, radiating an unimaginable sorrow and a palpable burning rage. The whispers, no longer mournful, coalesced into a single, piercingly cold voice that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the room, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. It was the voice of a child, raw with pain and fury, and it spoke a single chilling phrase, clear and unmistakable. "You will know my suffering. You will all know." The ledger on the desk, seemingly of its own accord, flipped open to a new blank page. And slowly, agonizingly, in the space where Dr. Alastair Finch had once written his horrific notes, a new entry began to appear, scrawled in an unseen hand, in what looked like freshly dried blood. January 23, 2024. Patients: Michael and Sarah. Diagnosis: uninvited guests. Protocol: final integration. Objective: to be continued. The shimmering, cold distortion over the table seemed to swell, its outlines becoming sharper, more defined, and a chilling, guttural scream, not human, not animal, but something far more ancient and terrifying, tore through the air, shaking the very foundations of the forgotten wing. They were no longer just observers of a forgotten tragedy. They were about to become the next entry in Dr. Alastair Finch's Phoenix Protocol. The shriek that tore through the very foundations of the forgotten wing wasn't just loud. It was visceral, a sound that vibrated in their bones, rattling their teeth and stealing the air from their lungs. Dust, thick and choking, rained down from the ceiling, illuminated by the frantic, flickering beams of their flashlights. The concrete floor beneath them bucked and groaned, threatening to give way. They were no longer just observers of a forgotten tragedy. They were about to become the next entry in Dr. Alistair Finch's Phoenix Protocol. Michael instinctively pulled Jessica close, shielding her as chunks of plaster exploded from the walls. David stumbled, hitting his head on a low-hanging pipe, but Emily was already at his side, steadying him. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized them. This wasn't a structural collapse. This was something alive, something immense awakening. The sound, a cacophony of grinding stone and a guttural, inhuman roar, seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once, but then it coalesced, focusing on the far end of the corridor, where a massive rusted steel door, previously unnoticed, now shuddered violently. It was thicker than any vault door they had ever seen, riveted with an impossible number of bolts, but even it strained against the force behind it. What was that? Jessica gasped, her voice thin and reedy. I don't know, Michael yelled over the continuous rumble. But we need to get out of here now. They turned, scrambling back the way they came, their footsteps echoing amidst the escalating chaos. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost metallic scent, like ozone mixed with something ancient and organic. As they ran, Michael's flashlight beam swept across the floor. He froze. From a hairline crack in the concrete, a shimmering, oily black substance began to seep. It wasn't water, nor was it blood. It was viscous, almost alive, expanding slowly, pulsating with a faint, inner light. More cracks appeared, spiderwebbing across the floor and up the walls, and from each the same dark ooze began to flow, like veins of a subterranean horror. Look! Emily screamed, pointing. The substance was spreading rapidly now, forming shallow pools that reflected the erratic light of their flashlights. It seemed to have a will of its own, flowing not just downwards with gravity, but upwards against it, creeping along the walls, coating the abandoned medical equipment in a glistening obsidian film. A sickening squelching sound accompanied its movement, a sound that made their stomachs churn. They were surrounded. The black goo was cutting off their escape, forming an ever-tightening net. We can't go back that way, David shouted, pointing to a section of the corridor where the substance had already formed a thick, waist-high barrier, writhing and churning like a primordial tar pit. The side rooms, Michael ordered. Check the patient rooms, maybe there's another exit or a way to cross. They burst into the nearest room, a sterile, abandoned space with a single bed and a rusted force stand. The black substance, however, was already here, seeping from the vents, dripping from the ceiling, and oozing from beneath the locked metal door. It was faster than they could have imagined. Jessica, her eyes wide with terror, stumbled back against a wall. Her hand brushed against a loose panel. It gave way with a soft click, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, nestled among cobwebs and dust, was a leather-bound journal, much thicker and more ornate than Finch's previous logbooks, along with a single tarnished brass key. Michael, look! She gasped, pulling it out. He snatched the journal, his mind racing. This had to be it. Finch's true findings, his ultimate madness. He flipped it open, ignoring the spreading blackness for a moment, desperate for answers. The script was Finch's, meticulous and chilling. Asterisk entry 417. Date, unknown. Time perpetual. Asterisk. Asterisk the primordial seed. I found it. Beneath the oldest foundations of this cursed earth. A consciousness older than time. A dormant will. Not a god, not a demon, but a fundamental principle of existence. A life force that predates all others. Sleeps but it hungers. It absorbs. It assimilates. It is true immortality. Asterisk. Michael's blood ran cold. He flipped pages frantically, his eyes scanning for keywords. Asterisk entry 432. The Phoenix Protocol. My grand design. Not merely to prolong life, but to transcend it. To merge human consciousness with the primordial seed. To become part of its eternal cycle. To be reborn not as flesh and bone, but as pure, unadulterated existence. The patients, they are the conduits. The vessels. The fuel. Asterisk. Jessica let out a choked sob. He wasn't curing them. He was feeding them to something. Asterisk entry 460. The seed grows restless. It responds to the influx. The initial subjects, they were crude attempts. Their minds shattered. Their bodies reshaped into aberrations. But I am learning. The resonance must be perfect. The transfer must be absolute. The wing itself, it is not merely a hospital. It is a crucible, a containment, a funnel for the seed's eventual re-emergence. Asterisk. The metallic scent intensified, and the air grew colder, heavy with an oppressive, malevolent presence. The black substance outside the room had grown into thick, roiling waves, pressing against the door, seeping through the gaps, tendrils beginning to snake under the frame. "He built this whole wing to contain it and to feed it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "And now it's awake." Asterisk entry 498. "It speaks to me now, not in words but in pure thought. It promises transcendence, promises oblivion. I am losing myself. The lines blur. Is it my will or its? The final stage is upon us. The true phoenix will rise, not from ashes, but from the collective consciousness of humanity, absorbed and transformed. My consciousness, it will be the first." Asterisk. The last entry was smeared, almost illegible, ending abruptly with a frantic scrawl. Asterisk. "It is not me. It is coming." Asterisk. A deafening crack tore through the ceiling above them, and a section of concrete gave way, showering them with dust and debris. Through the gaping hole they could see the dark, pulsating mass of the black substance, now forming into an immense, amorphous shape, filling the entire space above the corridor. It was vast, undulating, and strangely beautiful in its horror. "The Phoenix Protocol isn't a cure," David cried, his face pale with dread. "It's Finch's suicidal attempt to become part of this thing, and he designed this entire place to make it happen, using everyone as bait." The steel door at the far end of the corridor, the one that had been shuddering, now buckled inward with a thunderous groan, tearing from its hinges. From the black maw beyond, a piercing psychic shriek erupted, not through their ears but directly into their minds, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, a symphony of absorbed agony and ancient hunger. The black substance inside their room surged forward with impossible speed, coalescing into a grotesque, humanoid shape that shimmered and dripped, its form constantly shifting, tendrils reaching out like grasping fingers. It wasn't solid, it wasn't liquid. It was both and neither, a nightmare made manifest. "It knows we're here," Michael yelled, pushing Jessica behind him. The entity, if it could be called that, advanced. It had no discernible features, just an undulating mass that seemed to drink in the light, casting an unnatural gloom. It moved with a disturbing intelligence, bypassing the other objects in the room, focusing solely on them. A tendril, thicker than Michael's arm, lashed out, striking the wall with immense force, leaving a deep indentation. Another snake towards them, moving with terrifying speed. They dodged, scrambling backward, but the room was small, and the entity was growing, expanding, filling every available space. "The key," Jessica suddenly remembered, holding up the brass key she'd found with the journal. "Finch must have hidden it for a reason. There has to be another way out, a secret passage." Michael grabbed the key, his eyes darting around the room, desperate. The entity was almost upon them, its formless mass oozing closer, the air around it growing icy cold. He saw it then, a faint seam in the wall behind the bed, almost imperceptible, a hidden door disguised as part of the concrete. "Behind the bed. Help me move it," he roared. As they strained to push the heavy, rusted bed aside, the entity lunged, a massive wave of blackness enveloping the space where they had been moments before. They narrowly escaped, stumbling against the wall, revealing a small, almost invisible keyhole in the seam. Michael jammed the brass key in, turning it with a desperate click. The hidden door groaned, slowly sliding inwards, revealing not a passage, but a narrow, dark shaft leading straight down, into the blackness below. A faint, sickeningly sweet smell drifted up, and the sound of distant, rhythmic pulsing echoed from its depths. "Down!" Michael yelled, pushing Jessica towards the opening. "It's our only chance." But as Jessica reached the edge, a tendril, swift and silent, shot out from the expanding entity, wrapping around her ankle. She screamed, pulled off her feet, dragging her towards the amorphous horror. Michael lunged, grabbing her arm, pulling with all his might, but the entity's grip was impossibly strong, its black mass beginning to climb her leg, slowly, inexorably. The Phoenix Protocol was not just a name, it was a hungry, consuming reality, and it was claiming its first new subject. Michael screamed her name, a raw, guttural sound ripped from his throat, as he pulled against the invisible force. He clawed at the black mass, his fingers sinking into nothing and everything all at once, a chilling void that felt both frigid and searing. The entity pulsed, a malevolent shadow given form, its tendrils now snaking higher, encircling Jessica's waist, beginning to coil around her torso. Her eyes, wide with terror just moments before, began to glaze over, a strange, distant calm settling over her features that was far more horrifying than her screams. A faint, high-pitched hum resonated through the air, seeming to emanate from her very being, a sound that vibrated not just in his ears, but deep within his bones. Her skin, where the black mass touched, appeared to grow unnaturally pale, almost translucent, as if her very essence was being siphoned away, replaced by an encroaching darkness. "Jessica! Fight it!" Michael yelled, his voice cracking, but her gaze was fixed on something beyond him, beyond the room, lost in a terrifying reverie. He could feel the cold radiating from her, a chill that seeped into his own hands, a profound cold that felt utterly unnatural, like touching the heart of a dead star. He pulled again, putting every ounce of his strength into it, his muscles screaming in protest, but it was like trying to dislodge a mountain. The entity was rooted, immovable, its hold on Jessica absolute. He was losing her, watching her fade before his eyes, absorbed by this nameless horror. His gaze darted frantically around the lab, searching for anything, any weapon, any means to break the connection. The sterile metallic surfaces, the glowing panels, the intricate wiring, it all seemed to mock him, instruments of her demise. His eyes landed on the central console, the nexus of the pulsating energy, the source of the low thrum that now seemed to fill the entire room. He remembered the name, the Phoenix Protocol. Rebirth. Rising from the ashes. It wasn't just taking from her. It was giving her something, transforming her into something else entirely. The black mass wasn't just consuming. It was integrating. A desperate, reckless thought sparked in his mind, a flicker of an idea born from sheer terror and a primal need to save the woman he loved. If this entity was drawing power, if it was part of this system, then perhaps disrupting the system could disrupt it. He saw the thick, bundled conduits snaking from the main energy core directly into the apparatus connected to Jessica. An emergency override panel, clearly marked, gleamed menacingly on the console. It was a long shot, a gamble with unknown consequences, but he had no other choice. With a final, agonizing grunt, he tore his hands from Jessica, the cold burn lingering on his skin, and lunged toward the console. He slammed his palm onto the emergency override, twisting a heavy red dial with all his might. A deafening crackle ripped through the air, followed by a surge of brilliant blue-white electricity that arced violently across the panels. The entire lab plunged into darkness, the sudden silence amplified by the ringing in Michael's ears. Then the silence was shattered by a cacophony of blaring alarms, a frantic, piercing shriek that echoed off the cold metal walls. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the black mass convulsed, shuddering violently, its form wavering as if struggling against an unseen force. A sound, not quite a scream, but an agonizing silent shriek, seemed to tear through the air, vibrating in Michael's very core. The entity recoiled, its tendrils ripping away from Jessica with a sickening, tearing sound that wasn't audible but felt deeply, profoundly wrong. It writhed for a few agonizing seconds, then with a final, desperate ripple, dissipated into nothingness, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and something akin to burnt metal. Jessica slumped forward, her body going completely limp, the wires and sensors still attached to her. Michael scrambled to her side, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat. He gently pulled her away from the apparatus, cradling her in his arms. Her skin was still unnaturally cold, her eyes wide and staring, unfocused and vacant. She was breathing, a shallow, ragged gasp, but there was no light in her eyes, no recognition. She was there, but she wasn't there. "Jessica," he whispered, shaking her gently, his voice trembling. No response, only the chilling, hollow stare. Suddenly, a metallic, amplified voice boomed through the lab, distorted and filled with cold authority. "Intruder alert. Section Delta 9 compromised. Initiate lockdown protocol." It was Thorne, his voice unmistakable, laced with a chilling calm despite the chaos. He knew. He had been monitoring them. Michael's blood ran cold. He had mere seconds. He scanned the console one last time. Despite the power surge, one small monitor flickered back to life, displaying fragmented data, complex schematics, and a single chilling phrase that burned itself into his memory. "Consciousness transfer complete. Subject Alpha 7. Subject Alpha 7. Jessica." It had worked. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't just a threat. It was a terrifying success. His eyes darted to a small, almost imperceptible slot on the side of the console, a data port. A small metallic data stick, no bigger than his thumb, was jammed into it. This had to be it. This had to be the key, the record of what they'd done, what they'd become. With a desperate yank, he ripped the data stick free, stuffing it into his pocket. It was his only hope. He scooped Jessica into his arms. She was heavy, a dead weight, her head lolling against his shoulder. The hidden door they had entered through was now slightly ajar, a sliver of light from the corridor beyond piercing the darkness of the lab. The power surge must have disrupted the lock. He stumbled through the opening, the blare of the alarms echoing behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps and urgent, shouted commands growing closer. The hidden corridor was a labyrinth in the sudden darkness, lit only by the faint, flickering screen of his phone. He could hear Thorne's voice again, closer now, giving rapid-fire orders to unseen security personnel. Seal all exits. Quadrant 5 move. Do not engage, secure the subjects. Michael didn't know if Thorne meant him or Jessica or both. He just knew he had to get out. He remembered the emergency exit they had seen earlier. A heavy steel door marked with a faded, almost invisible symbol. He fumbled for it, pushing against the rusted metal with all his might, the dead weight of Jessica in his arms making every movement an agonizing struggle. The door creaked open with a groan that seemed deafening in the silence between alarm bursts. Beyond it lay a narrow, unused service tunnel, thick with dust and cobwebs, clearly untouched for years. It was a desperate, forgotten escape route. He dragged Jessica through, the heavy door slamming shut behind them with a resounding clang that muffled the alarms to a distant thrum. The tunnel was pitch black, the air thick and stale, smelling of earth and disuse. He stumbled forward, his phone beam cutting a narrow path through the oppressive darkness, his heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The contrast was jarring. The high-tech, horrifying lab versus this forgotten, mundane corner of the hospital's underbelly. He pushed on, his lungs burning, his arms aching, until he found a hidden stairwell, its steps worn smooth with age, leading up. He emerged into a forgotten corner of the hospital's vast basement, near the old, dormant laundry facilities. He was out of the hidden wing, but he wasn't safe. Jessica was still unresponsive, a terrifying shell of her former self. He knew he couldn't call the police. Who would believe a wild story about a hidden wing, a black entity and consciousness transfer? And what if Thorne had deeper connections, reaching beyond the hospital walls? He couldn't risk taking Jessica to another hospital, not in her current state, not with Thorne undoubtedly mobilizing his forces. He needed answers, and he needed to protect Jessica, even from the very institutions designed to heal. His apartment. It was a risk, but it was the only place he could think of where he might have a moment to breathe, to assess the data stick, to try and understand what had happened to Jessica. He navigated the labyrinthine hospital corridors, a ghost in the night, trying to appear as inconspicuous as possible, carrying an unresponsive woman as if she were merely asleep. The irony was bitter. Trapped in a place of healing, yet unable to trust a single soul within its walls. He made it to the main entrance, slipping out into the cool night air, the indifferent glow of the city lights doing nothing to dispel the chilling horror that clung to him. He gently laid Jessica in the passenger seat of his car, buckling her in, his hands shaking. He looked at her, her eyes still vacant, staring straight ahead, a single solitary tear tracing a path down her pale cheek. Was it her tear? Or the tear of something new, something alien, now inhabiting her body, trapped in a silent scream? The horror wasn't over. It had just begun. He had a piece of the puzzle, a fragile data stick, but the full, terrifying picture of the Phoenix Protocol remained a gaping, consuming void. David stumbled back, the data stick clutched in his hand, his mind a scrambled mess of terror and disbelief. Emily, the Emily he knew, gone, replaced by a silent, screaming horror that wore her skin. The air in that sterile room, previously just cold, now felt like a suffocating shroud, thick with unspoken atrocities. He had to get out. Now. He fumbled for the door, his fingers slick with cold sweat, the metallic click echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence. He didn't dare look back at the glass panel, at Emily, at whatever unspeakable thing they had done to her. His legs felt like lead, but a primal, desperate urge for survival propelled him forward. The corridor outside was still empty, but the silence felt predatory, as if the very walls were watching him, waiting for him to make a sound. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, Every distant hum of machinery seemed to morph into a warning. He moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed, his breath catching in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He traced his steps back, past the closed doors, the flickering fluorescent lights, the unsettling quiet. The thought of running into Dr. Eris, or anyone connected to this place, sent a fresh wave of ice through him. He was a trespasser, an accidental witness to something monstrous, and he knew with chilling certainty that they wouldn't just let him walk away. He reached the maintenance stairwell, the heavy fire door a welcome sight. He pushed it open, the screech of hinges grating on his raw nerves, and plunged into the dim concrete stairwell. He didn't stop until he burst through the ground floor exit, finding himself in a deserted service corridor of the main hospital. The familiar, if still unsettling, sounds of a normal hospital, a distant intercom, the rumble of a gurney, the muffled chatter were a jarring contrast to the tomb-like silence of the wing. He blended in, moving quickly through the labyrinthine corridors, his face carefully neutral, his eyes darting, searching for any sign that he had been followed. He needed to disappear. He didn't stop until he was safely in his apartment, the door locked, the blinds drawn. The mundane familiarity of his living room offered little comfort. The horror he had witnessed clung to him like a shroud, chilling him to the bone. He stripped off his clothes, feeling tainted, and stood under the hottest shower he could bear, scrubbing at his skin as if to wash away the memory, the chill of Emily's vacant stare, the silent scream. It was useless. The image was burned into his mind. Finally, wrapped in a towel, heart still racing, he focused on the data stick. It was small, unassuming, a simple USB drive. But he knew it held answers, or at least fragments of them. He plugged it into his laptop, his hands trembling. The drive contained a single encrypted folder labeled Project Phoenix, Alpha Phase Logs. His blood ran cold. Phoenix Protocol. This was it. He tried to open it, but it required a complex key. He spent frantic minutes, his mind racing, trying common passwords, birth dates, anything. Nothing. Then a thought struck him. Emily's old patient ID, combined with Eris's last name. He typed it in, a desperate shot in the dark. The folder unlocked. What unfolded on his screen was a terrifying glimpse into a world beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't a neatly organized document. It was a chaotic collection of files. Fragmented audio recordings, blurred schematics, technical data logs filled with medical jargon he barely understood, and chilling patient profiles. The audio recordings were the worst. They were mostly Dr. Eris's voice, calm, detached, narrating progress reports. Patient 7 Gamma, showing advanced neural integration with the cortical implant. Initial consciousness mapping successful. Subject responsive to external stimuli, albeit with reduced motor function. Another later entry, 7 Gamma, exhibiting unexpected neural feedback loops. Subject's original consciousness appears to be struggling against the new overlay. Signs of acute distress, but motor and vocal pathways compromised. A minor setback. Then, an entry that made David's stomach churn. 7 Gamma, consciousness overlay complete. Original neural patterns suppressed. New directives being uploaded. The Phoenix rises. Patient 7 Gamma, Emily. The schematics were even more disturbing. They depicted intricate neural interfaces, brain implants, and diagrams of what looked like elaborate sensory deprivation tanks, connected to complex computing arrays. The technical logs mentioned consciousness transfer, neural repatterning, and synthetic personality matrices. They spoke of preserving essential selfhood, while optimizing the host body. Optimizing. They were talking about Emily. He scrolled through patient profiles. There were dozens, all with similar trajectories. Initial illness, admission to the wing, then a series of treatments that mirrored Emily's. Many had similar notes about neural feedback loops and consciousness suppression. Some logs ended abruptly, marked protocol failure, subject terminated. Others, like Emily's, concluded with Phoenix Protocol Phase 2 engaged. David's breath hitched. Phase 2. What could be worse than what he saw? The overall picture emerging from the data stick was one of a horrifying, audacious experiment. The complete overhaul of human consciousness. They weren't just treating illnesses, they were replacing minds, creating something new within existing bodies. The wing that isn't on the blueprint wasn't a place for healing. It was a laboratory for a grotesque form of human engineering. He immediately called Sarah. His voice was hoarse, strained, barely recognizable. "Sarah, it's David. You won't believe what I found. It's worse than we thought. So much worse." Sarah, recognizing the terror in his voice, arrived at his apartment within 20 minutes, her expression a mixture of concern and grim determination. He didn't waste time, pulling up the files on his laptop. As she read through the logs, her face grew pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional horror. "My God, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This is beyond unethical. This is a scientific abomination. Neural repatterning? Synthetic personality matrices? They're not just saving lives, they're erasing them, replacing them." "Emily," David said, his voice raw. "She was 7 Gamma. That thing I saw, that was the new overlay. The Phoenix." Sarah traced a finger over one of the schematics. "This is incredibly advanced. The level of bioengineering and neurocomputing required for something like this, it's staggering and terrifying. They're essentially building a new mind inside a person's existing brain, or perhaps transferring a pre-existing consciousness into a new host. The Phoenix is a new beginning, a new entity, rising from the ashes of the old. But who are they transferring? What are they building?" David demanded, the questions burning in his throat. "And why? For what purpose?" "The data stick doesn't give a clear answer on the who or the ultimate why," Sarah replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But there are hints. Look at these funding logs. It's not just hospital money. There are shell corporations, offshore accounts, and a recurring name, Ethelgard Foundation. I've heard of them. They're a shadowy philanthropic group, known for funding cutting-edge, often controversial, medical research." "Ethelgard," David repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "So this isn't just Eris. This is a massive, well-funded operation." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed, her gaze hardening. "And if Eris is involved, he's just a piece of a much larger puzzle. This Phoenix protocol isn't confined to a single wing in this hospital. This hospital is likely just one facility in a network. A research hub, perhaps. The scale of this, it's global, David. And the implications are horrifying. Imagine a world where your consciousness isn't truly yours, where it can be overwritten, replaced, resurrected as something else." The full weight of their discovery settled on them, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just a hospital secret. It was a fundamental violation of what it meant to be human. They weren't just dealing with a rogue doctor. They were up against a powerful, clandestine organization with unimaginable resources and a terrifying agenda. "They won't let us live with this knowledge," David stated, the truth cold and stark. "I've seen too much. We have this data. We're a threat." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his, filled with a shared, desperate understanding. "We need to go public. But we need more. This data stick is damning, but it's only part of the story. We need to expose the whole network, the true scope of Project Phoenix. And Eris, he's the key to understanding the deeper purpose." As she spoke, a chilling thought struck David. The blank stare in Emily's eyes, the utter stillness of her body, the sense of something else inhabiting her. It wasn't just a mind replaced, it was a vessel repurposed. For what? For whom? The Phoenix was rising, not as a symbol of rebirth, but as a harbinger of a new, terrifying age where identity itself was a malleable commodity. The silence in the apartment was broken only by the hum of the laptop and the frantic beating of their hearts. They had uncovered a truth so profound and so horrifying that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of their understanding of life and death. And now they were inextricably caught in its chilling embrace. The horror wasn't over. It had just begun. He had a piece of the puzzle, a fragile data stick, but the full terrifying picture of the Phoenix protocol remained a gaping, consuming void. But now that void had a name, a shape, and a terrifying agenda, and they were standing directly in its path. The air in the hidden office crackled with an unspoken dread, a suffocating realization of the enormity of what they had just uncovered. Michael felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Jessica's eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were wide with a chilling understanding. David stood rigid, his hand instinctively going to the small, fragile data stick clutched in Michael's palm. The Phoenix Protocol. It wasn't just a secret project. It was a terrifying vision, a complete re-engineering of human will disguised as medical advancement. Before they could fully process the ramifications, a faint click echoed from the corridor outside. It was too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. A shadow flickered beneath the door. "They know," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael didn't need to be told twice. He knew the layout of this section of the hospital from his father's old blueprints, the ones that didn't show this wing. He also knew the hidden service tunnels, relics from an earlier, more expansive design that Thorne had likely overlooked. "Follow me," he urged, already moving towards a discreet, almost invisible panel in the wall behind a dusty filing cabinet. It was a maintenance access point he'd seen in a faded diagram in his father's archives, a detail so obscure it might as well have been a ghost. They slipped through just as the door to Dr. Eris's office swung open. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, entered the room they had just vacated. Michael heard a low, guttural curse, then the unmistakable sound of a phone being lifted. "They're gone. Seal the perimeter. And find them. Now." The voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with an icy fury that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. It was Dr. Elias Thorne. Navigating the cramped, dark service tunnels was a desperate scramble. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of David's phone flashlight as they moved through a labyrinth of pipes and conduits. The air was thick with the smell of stale air and something metallic. Michael's mind raced, piecing together the fragments they had gathered. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't about healing the sick. It was about remaking them. The experiments Dr. Eris had detailed, the cognitive restructuring, the personality optimization. It was all a monstrous euphemism for stripping away individuality, replacing it with a compliant, pre-programmed persona. Thorne wasn't just building a better healthcare system. He was building a better human. Jessica, ever the pragmatist, was already working on the data stick. "This isn't just theory, Michael," she said, her voice tight with suppressed horror. "There are patient files here. Real people. Their original identities, their medical histories, and then a second set of files. Completely different. New personalities, new memories, even new skill sets. They're creating entirely new individuals out of existing ones. And the wing that isn't on the blueprint, that's where it all happens." They emerged from the tunnels into a dimly lit, sterile corridor, starkly different from the main hospital. This was it, the hidden wing. The energy here was palpable, a humming, almost vibrating sensation that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It felt less like a hospital and more like a laboratory, a silent, unholy cathedral of scientific ambition. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor. Nurse Emily. Her eyes were wide with fear, but also a flicker of something else, determination. "Dr. Thorne knows you're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's activated the lockdown. No one gets in or out without his authorization. He's furious. He called the security team, but I distracted them long enough for you to get this far." "Emily, why are you helping us?" Michael asked, a mix of gratitude and suspicion in his tone. She wrung her hands. "Because I saw it. I saw what they were doing to the patients. The blank stares. The way they spoke like echoes of other people. My conscience. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Dr. Eris, he tried to warn me. He knew it was wrong, but Thorne has a way of twisting logic, of making you believe you're part of something revolutionary." She gestured towards a heavy, reinforced door at the far end of the corridor. "That's the main chamber, where the procedures take place. If you want proof, you'll find it there. But be careful. He's probably waiting." As if on cue, the lights in the corridor flickered, then intensified, bathing the stark white walls in an unnerving glow. A voice, amplified and resonant, boomed through hidden speakers. "Michael, Jessica, David, you've come a long way. But you've reached the end of your journey. You see, this facility, this wing is not just a place. It's the future. And you, my dear friends, are standing in the way of progress." Dr. Thorne appeared at the entrance to the main chamber, flanked by two burly security guards. He was impeccably dressed, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his smile serene, almost benevolent. He held a tablet in his hand, its screen glowing faintly. "The Phoenix Protocol, Michael, is not about control. It's about liberation. Imagine a world free of mental illness, addiction, even undesirable personality traits. A world where every individual is optimized, productive, content. We don't erase, we refine. We don't control, we guide." "You're playing God, Thorne," David roared, stepping forward. "You're stealing people's identities." Thorne chuckled softly. A dramatic interpretation, I assure you. These individuals, they are not stolen. They are reborn. Their former selves were flawed, broken. We offer them a chance at a perfect existence. And soon, Michael, your family's legacy, this hospital will be known not for its past, but for ushering in this glorious future. My father would be disgusted, Michael retorted, gripping the data stick tighter. He built this hospital to heal, not to weaponize medicine. Your father was a man of his time, Thorne countered, his eyes glinting. Limited by outdated ethics. We are beyond that. We are at the precipice of a new human experience. And the evidence you hold, that data stick, merely contains the blueprints for this new world. It will only serve to prove my vision. It proves your crimes, Jessica cut in, her voice sharp. Forced cognitive restructuring, identity theft, human experimentation without consent. This isn't refinement, Thorne. It's a horror show. Thorne's smile faltered, replaced by a cold, hard stare. Enough. Give me the data stick. This ends now. He signaled to his guards. But before they could move, Nurse Emily, with a sudden surge of adrenaline, lunged forward, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall. With surprising strength, she aimed and unleashed a cloud of chemical foam directly at the guards, momentarily blinding and disorienting them. Go. Get out. Expose him, she cried, turning to face Thorne, her face etched with defiance. Emily, you fool. Thorne roared, his composure finally cracking. Now, Michael yelled, seizing the opportunity. They bolted towards the main chamber, the heavy door Emily had indicated. Jessica, with her tech skills, immediately began trying to override the lock. The air was thick with the acrid smell of the extinguisher, and behind them, Thorne's furious shouts mingled with the sputtering coughs of his guards. The lock clicked open. They burst inside. The chamber was vast, circular, and filled with a chilling array of advanced medical equipment. Glass pods lined the walls, each containing a patient hooked up to a complex network of wires and monitors. Their faces were serene, almost blissful, but utterly devoid of expression. They looked like mannequins, perfect and empty. In the center of the room, a large, pulsating holographic display showed intricate neural pathways being rewired, overlaid with schematic diagrams of personality traits and behavioral patterns. It was the Phoenix Protocol in horrifying action. This is it, Jessica whispered, staring at the screens. They're literally rewriting minds. And here I thought you'd appreciate the artistry, Jessica, Thorne's voice echoed from behind them. He had recovered quickly, his two guards now flanking him, their faces grim. A shame you lack the vision. This is not a prison, it is a canvas. And these are my masterpieces. Michael knew they were cornered. The data stick was their only weapon. You won't get away with this, Thorne, he said, holding it aloft. The world will see what you're doing here. The world will see what I want them to see, Thorne countered, his gaze fixed on the data stick. A momentary blip, a disgruntled former employee's ramblings, perhaps. Your word against mine, Michael. And I have resources. Influence. You have a flimsy piece of plastic. He took a step forward. Give it to me. No. David lunged, tackling the nearest guard. A brief, chaotic struggle ensued. Michael knew this was their chance. He looked at Jessica. Get this out. Upload it. Anything. Jessica nodded, her fingers flying across her phone screen, attempting to establish a connection, but the chamber was heavily shielded. No signal. They've jammed it. Thorne advanced, his eyes narrowed. Clever, aren't they? Now hand it over. Suddenly, a loud, piercing alarm blared through the chamber. Red lights flashed, casting sinister shadows. Nurse Emily appeared in the doorway, breathless but triumphant. I triggered the main fire alarm. The whole hospital is evacuating. Emergency services will be here any minute. Thorne's face contorted in a snarl. You traitorous fool. He lunged past his guards directly at Michael, reaching for the data stick. Michael sidestepped, but Thorne was surprisingly agile. They grappled, the data stick clutched precariously between them. Michael felt a jolt of electricity, a surge of adrenaline. He couldn't let it fall. This was everything. The truth. The future of these patients. His father's legacy, now twisted into a monstrous mockery. With a desperate surge of strength, Michael twisted, using Thorne's momentum against him, sending the doctor stumbling backward. The data stick flew from Michael's grasp, skittering across the polished floor towards one of the glass pods. No! Thorn bellowed, diving for it. But David, having subdued his guard, was quicker. He swept it up, tossing it to Jessica. "Run! Get it outside." Jessica didn't hesitate. She sprinted towards the now open door, Emily right behind her, guiding her through the chaos of the evacuating hospital. Michael and David faced Thorn, who now stood alone, his face a mask of furious desperation. "You've ruined everything," Thorn screamed, lunging at Michael. This wasn't about the data anymore, it was personal. But the blare of sirens was growing louder, echoing through the hospital corridors. The Phoenix Protocol, once a meticulously guarded secret, was now exposed, its horrifying ambition laid bare for the world to see. Emergency responders, guided by the fire alarm and Emily's desperate calls, were already breaching the outer perimeter. Michael and David held Thorn at bay, not needing to fight, merely to stall. The game was up. The blueprints for a terrifying future, once confined to a hidden wing, were now in the open. The patients in their glass pods remained serene, their new identities perhaps already etched into their minds, a chilling testament to Thorn's twisted vision. In the ensuing chaos, with police and paramedics swarming the hidden wing, Thorn was apprehended, his protests about medical innovation and human betterment falling on deaf ears. Jessica, having made it to the street, immediately uploaded the contents of the data stick to a global news network, ensuring the evidence would be seen by millions before Thorn or his powerful allies could suppress it. The hospital wing that wasn't on the blueprint became a crime scene, a chilling monument to unchecked scientific ambition. The patients, their original identities stolen, their minds repurposed, became a harrowing symbol of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of progress. Michael, Jessica, and David, forever changed by their terrifying journey into the heart of the Phoenix Protocol, knew they had stopped something truly insidious. But as the full scope of Thorn's network and influence slowly unraveled in the coming months, they also understood a darker truth. The desire to optimize humanity, to play God with the very essence of identity, was not an isolated madness. It was a seductive whisper that, in the wrong hands, could always resurface, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another hidden blueprint, another secret wing, another chance to redefine what it means to be human.